God has called us, commissioned us, and commanded us to reach our neighbors with the message and love of Christ. But this is almost impossible if we don't know our neighbors. So where do we start to build relationships that will lead to opportunities to accomplish the purpose that we were created for? To go to heaven and take as many people with us as possible. We've been working our way through the simple acronym START, a simple but very intentional way to make an eternal difference in the lives of our neighbors. It's intentional, it's natural, and it's simple. You just have to start. S is to start with prayer. The first and most powerful thing we must do is to begin with prayer. It's powerful. And when we genuinely and consistently begin by praying for our neighbors, we can expect God to act. And He will open up opportunities to meet our neighbors and use us to make a great impact. T is talk with them about their story. If you're listening to your neighbors, they will tell you how to reach, serve, and care for them. A is for ask them to a meal. So much of Jesus' ministry was around a table for a meal. And if every Christian household just regularly invited the unchurched neighbors into a home for a meal just once a month, we would reach our valley for Christ and follow His example in caring for others. R stands for reach out with service, and our example again is Jesus. He set the example with the incredible words, "For the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give His life to rescue many people." Life-altering moments of impact happen mostly through small things done consistently over time. The final T stands for tell your story. Knowing someone's story changes everything. Too often, people have very confused understandings about Christians. They see them on TV or represented in a movie, or maybe they've had a bad experience with someone who calls themselves a Christian. Our neighbors need to know that we are different, not weird. They also need to hear how they can start an adventure with Christ. And this takes courage. Let's be honest. For many people, this is probably the most scary part of Christ's call to reach our neighbors for Him. We're uncomfortable with how to tell our story. A friend of mine says it this way: behind every door is someone who matters to God, and that person has a story to be told. We've all heard Pastor Don say people matter to God, and they must matter to us. But how do you share Christ with others? Some people are very confrontational and scare their neighbors away. They ask questions like, if you were to die tonight, do you know for sure you'd go to heaven? Or are you saved? Do you know Jesus? Or do you want to go to heaven? And that scares people. Some people never speak up at all. They never talk about Jesus or their adventure with Him or CCV. This is the other extreme that doesn't work either. Romans 10:14 says, "But how can people call for help if they don't know who to trust? And how can they know who to trust if they haven't heard of the one who can be trusted? And how can they hear if no one tells them?" There is tremendous power in story, your story. Be genuine and honest. Simply share what your life was like before you met Jesus, or how your life is different now that you know Jesus. Don't force it, but don't ignore it. Be courageous and share your adventure. Start thinking now about how you could share your story in 3 minutes or less. It takes practice and planning, but what could be more important than leading your neighbor to an adventure with Jesus Christ?
Letters are a lost art. Not many people write letters anymore. Mostly because of email. It's just so convenient to type a brief note, send it anywhere in the world. So the 90s pretty much changed everything for letter writing. And then now it's like texting, right? You can just get on your phone and pop a quick text to someone. You know how many texts the average teenager sends in a month? You're not going to believe this. 3,339 texts. Every teenager or average teenager each month. That's over 111 a day. They're pretty busy on their smartphones. But now also they're tweeting. You get 140 characters to send out your message to the world. So as Jerry Seinfeld says, you can now say almost nothing to virtually everyone at the same time. Beautiful. But as we're saying less and less to more and more people, I think the art of letters is going to become even more powerful for our culture. And those who do write letters are going to say a whole lot more with those letters. I know for Barbara and I, we have this file in our file cabinet at home, and if there's ever a fire at our house, this is what we're going for. This is a file of letters that we wrote to each of our children, one letter per child per month, and it catalogs their growing up years, what they were doing that month, how they grew, mistakes they made, or the fights we got into. This is their life, and for us, this is pretty precious. I know I've got some other letters that I've got stashed away from really special people that intersected in my life in important ways. One whole file is just says thank you. Different students over the years or different people that I was pastor for at that time just poured into their life, and they wrote me a letter of gratitude. On my rainy days, when I'm feeling like, what am I doing? I'll pull out that file and read a few of those, and it reminds me of who I am. There's one letter, probably more than every other letter I cherish, is from my son. When he graduated from high school, he just wrote this long letter that thanked us for what we poured into his life and what we meant to him. Man, I'm going to keep that one in a special place. You have a letter like that? Something that is kind of your go-to letter that you want to keep that because it's a special memory from a special person. Why don't you just share with the group right now what that special letter is for you, who it's from, what occasion it was written, and what it means to you. This week in the story, chapter 30, we're reading about Paul's final days. And we talked about kind of his adventures through the book of Acts and all the churches he planted. But on page 456 through 458, there's a letter that Paul wrote. And as a matter of fact, it's the very last letter he ever wrote. He wrote a number, most of the New Testament books, they're not really books at all. They're letters that Paul wrote to different churches or different individuals. This one is special because in this letter, he's pouring out his heart from a dungeon to one of his disciples, a young man named Timothy that he met early on in his preaching tour. And now after all these decades, he's circling back around to Timothy, and the last thing he wrote before he died, as far as we know, was this letter to his friend, his disciple. And I want to pick up from this letter how to write letters to other people. In fact, we've passed out envelopes and letters, or a piece of paper and pens to you so that you can write a letter right now. During this meeting, we want you to write a letter to one of three people. And Paul's going to mention all of these people in this particular letter. First, there's the circle. There's the circle above, people who have poured into your life. There's the circle below, people that you're pouring into. And the circle around you, the people that you do battle with. And so I want to look first at these people who are in the circle above you. I want to ask you, is there a person in your circle above that you would want to write a letter to? And if so, does Paul give you any kind of clue how you might shape your own letter? I want to read from 2 Timothy verses 3 through 5. It says, I thank God, whom I serve as my ancestors did, with a clear conscience, as night and day I constantly remember you in my prayers. Recalling your tears, I long to see you so that I may be filled with joy. I'm reminded of your sincere faith, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I'm persuaded now lives in you. When Paul writes to Timothy, he says, Timothy, you're a good man. And he was. Timothy and Paul had a long, long history. It goes back in the book of Acts to chapter 14. Timothy lived in a little burb called Lystra, pretty kind of out-of-the-way place, filled with superstitions and, frankly, a lot of non-believers. His mother was a Jewess, and so was his grandmother, Lois and Eunice. His father, however, we learn was a Greek. He wasn't a man of faith, a man who served the Lord God of the Bible. So Timothy grew up in this mixed home, and because of that, he took some of the heritage from his mother and some of the heritage from his father. Specifically, his father never had him circumcised. It's an outpatient surgery for Jews that marked them in a very specific way as Jews. For Greeks, that would be seen as a mark of shame. So his dad never wanted to mark him like that. But his mother and grandmother marked him with scriptures. And I guess his dad said, okay, you can teach him about the Jewish scriptures, but don't go cutting on my son. Well, I don't know when Timothy's dad died, but sometime probably after the death of his father, Paul comes into Timothy's life. You know how? He's just an itinerant preacher, comes into town, and he does an extraordinary miracle. Heals a guy who was lame from birth, like lifts him up by the hand in the city gate. It was public. Everybody saw it. No questioning. Paul, he had a miracle of God. And so everyone's ready to follow him. But when a group came from another city, another group of Jewish people, they were jealous of Paul because his preaching was so popular. They stirred up the crowds and turned them against Paul. Well, how do you turn a miracle, how do you turn people against a miracle worker? It's easy. See, in the ancient world, nobody denied that there was miraculous divine power. They just questioned whether it came from a good God or whether it came from a bad God. And when these Jews came into town and said, Paul, oh no, his power comes from a very dark place. You don't want to mess with him. And so they stoned him. Like literally, they took baseball-sized rocks and pummeled Paul until it looked like he was dead. They thought they killed him. And we don't know exactly how it came about. But a group of Christians surrounded Paul after the murderous crowd dissipated. And pretty soon they started to notice he was breathing. And somebody picked him up and took him into their house that night. And they had to do it quietly so he wouldn't get executed again. You know whose house I think it was? I think it was Timothy's. When Lois and Eunice take Paul and they nurse him back to health, and the next day Paul, with his friends, limp out of town and run away. Years later, when they return, Timothy, he's no longer a teenager. He's a young man, early 20s. Paul looked at Timothy and said, "Son, I want you to follow me." And he did. That takes a whole lot of courage. Given that Timothy watched Paul get stoned, given that they're going from city to city to city to people who are going to be even more antagonistic to Paul than Timothy's hometown. I don't know where Timothy got that courage, but I know it came from the circle above him, maybe from his mother Lois or grandmother Eunice or Paul, his spiritual father. Let me ask you, is there someone in your circle above you that gave you that kind of courage? It says here that Timothy knew the scriptures of God because he had been taught by his mother and grandmother. Maybe it's a person for you that taught you scriptural principles, that taught you the Bible, or someone who just, when no one else believed in you, they believed in you. Is there perhaps a coach or a stepfather or a grandmother that deserves a letter from you? I want to take a couple minutes and just let you share with one another the people who are in the circle above you and how they poured into your life a faith and a courage to live for Jesus Christ. And maybe when we write our letters at the end of the session, one of these people will be the recipient of your letter. There's a second circle that we all have. It's a circle below us. People that look up to us as a spiritual mentor. I don't know, most of us don't even feel qualified to have people look up to us as a spiritual mentor. And we might think, man, nobody's like looking up to me as Timothy looked up to Paul. But most of us do have those kind of people in our lives. It could be some kid in the neighborhood that you pass by when you're walking your dog each day. They don't have a father, and you don't even know, but the kind words you say to them are about the only kind words they get all day. It could be someone that is on a sports team that you help coach, or someone that is in a group where you volunteer at church. All of us have people who look up to us as Timothy looked up to Paul. And we need to learn to leverage that as we pour into the people who are in the circle below us. Paul said this to Timothy in chapter 2, "You then, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus. And the things you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable people who will also be qualified to teach others." That's a process of mentoring. As I read that, did you catch how many layers there were, or how many generations that Paul has in mind when he mentors? It's actually 4. Where Paul says, "Here I am, Timothy, and what you've heard me say, I've passed on to you in public, and I want you to pass it on to others who will be capable of passing it on to others." The purpose of mentoring is never 2 generations, it's always 4 generations. That what I pass on to you, you will pass on to others who will be qualified to pass it on to others as well. Therein lies the security of the future of the church. How do we get at that kind of mentoring? Well, Paul gives 3 illustrations here in the following verses. He says, "Join with me in suffering like a good soldier of Christ Jesus. No one serving as a soldier gets entangled in civilian affairs, but rather tries to please his commanding officer." Paul says, illustration number 1, you want to be a great mentor, you got to be like a soldier. And that means if you're a soldier, you bow out of civilian affairs and you devote yourself just to military affairs. You are a man owned by the army. So if you're going to be a good mentor, you're going to have to make some decisions about where to focus your energies. And you're not like everybody else who can do whatever they want. You're a man or a woman who has devoted their lives to the army of the living God, and that's where your priority and your allegiance lies. Paul's second example is of an athlete. He says, "Similarly, anyone who competes as an athlete does not receive the victor's crown except by competing according to the rules." It doesn't matter what sport you compete in. You have rules of how to play the game. And if you break those rules, you don't win the prize. It might be baseball. You got to run the bases in a certain order. Or track. You got to run in between the lines. Doesn't matter what sport. You got some guidelines, some parameters. And when you're mentoring, you have some parameters as well. You don't get to make up the rules because all eyes are on you. You have someone who is imitating your life. So if you had a child who was watching you, would you be embarrassed for them to live out what you just did? If you had some teenagers in your house, would you be ashamed for them to say what you just said? Look, athletes aren't like everybody else. They have a different set of disciplines, a different set of rules that they follow. Have you tightened your parameters to such an extent that those following you have a clear and godly model of how to live their life? The third example Paul gives is a farmer. He says, "The hardworking farmer should be the first to receive a share of the crops. Reflect on what I'm saying, for the Lord will give you insight into all of this." I can tell you, those who choose to be mentors, it's hard work. It pays big. There is a harvest at the end of your investment. If you choose to abandon civilian affairs, if you choose to live by a tighter set of parameters, you will reap a reward. Now, I want you to think as we discuss this about a person who is in a circle below you, a person that, man, they would love to get a letter from you, a physical letter, not a tweet, not an email, not a text, but something that you took the time to think about and write out. You may be writing the letter that is going to be in their file until the day they die. But in order to write that letter well, you need to live the life well. So let's discuss these three things. What perhaps may you need to abandon so that your life is focused more on things of God? Or what parameters might you need to tighten so that your life is an example to those who are watching you? And then perhaps you could say, here's a benefit I would hope to reap if I poured into this particular person. Imagine with me an old man, probably about 68, maybe a little older, but he's an old 68. Dude's been beat up all his life, chased from town to town, stoned, flogged, shipwrecked. He's old, he's tired, he's weary. And he's sitting in a cold, dank dungeon, just a thin, frail figure, still has fire in his eyes. And he still has a couple messages that he wants to preach. And so he picks up his pen and he closes out his very last letter with these words. For I am already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time for my departure is near. I've fought the good fight. I've finished the race. I've kept the faith. Now there's in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing. And you expect Paul to put an exclamation point, put down his pen, lean back, and be done. He's not. Because that paragraph is about Paul. His final paragraph is about the circle around him, the people who fought with him. This circle for Paul was essential because in his dying days, the people that he did battle with for the gospel became more and more important to him. Listen to some of the names that Paul lays down on paper. Do your best to come to me quickly, for Demas, because he loved this world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia and Titus to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you because he's helpful to me in my ministry. I sent Tychicus to Ephesus. When you come, bring the cloak I left with Carpus at Troas and my scrolls, especially the parchments. This last paragraph is least interesting to us of the whole book. But I think for Paul, it's the most interesting because these are the people he did life with. For Paul, these are the people like you're sitting with in the living room right now. These are the people that stood by him through thick and through thin. And there were some that abandoned him. Demas, for example. Paul said, because he loved this world, he abandoned me. Look, the people in this room, one or two of them might hurt you. There are going to be some who have to leave. Paul mentions a couple of those. Crescens had gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. Those were people he loved. No problem with them leaving to go on to another ministry that God calls them to, but even that hurts when people leave the group. And then there's Luke. Man, he's been with Paul for decades. They were friends thick from a long time ago. And then there's this interesting name, Mark. Technically, John Mark. And you might remember way back when in Acts 13, John Mark went on Paul's very first missionary journey, got tired in the middle of it and left. It soured Paul. I mean, for a long time. Paul even said he apostatized. He abandoned us. And Barnabas had to step in and go, Paul, come on, it wasn't apostasy. I don't know why John Mark left. But in these intervening years, the bitterness has faded. Maybe because Paul got softer or maybe because John Mark got tougher, but somehow they met in the middle, and one of the last people that the Apostle Paul ever called for was this young guy that he had poured into years before that he now considers a colleague that he wants by his side. This circle around us is critically important. And you may have other circles other than this neighborhood group, but this is one of the most important circles that you can have around you. And some of you know that good and well. And I think it's time right now to look around the room and begin to speak to one another words that are true. You might need to look at someone across the room and say, you know what, you've been helping host this group for 6 months, a year. It's time for you to go start your own group. You need to go to another ministry and help reach our neighbors for Christ. You might need to look at someone across the room and say, you know, several different times during this last 6 months, you've mentioned that you wanted to do this particular ministry. What are you waiting for? With our prayers, with my support, let's go do this together. And I hope that there's some of you in this room that would look right across at another couch or another chair and say, you know what? I think you're a person that I need in the inner circle of my life. Let's start a T group together where we become transparent with the deepest struggles and the highest dreams that we have. This is a time that we encourage one another. The Bible calls it exhorting one another to love and good deeds. But use your words right now to speak truth, not about yourself, but about someone else in the room, to help this circle tighten and broaden. All of us have three circles in our lives. Circle above, circle around, circle below. That circle above us are those mentors that poured into us, those coaches, parents, grandparents, stepfathers. That they taught us scriptures, and they taught us how to live with dignity and purpose in our lives. That circle around us, those are the people mostly we get our laughter from and share our tears with. They're the ones that strengthen us through difficult days. And that circle below, they're the ones who look up to us and in some ways give us clarity of who we are because we begin to see ourselves through their eyes as leaders and mentors, parents. I want to ask you to write one letter to one person in one of those circles. Just choose one. It might be someone that is a mentor to you and you've never really said thank you. It could be someone around you that you say, you know, had it not been for you, I wouldn't have gotten through this dark night of the soul. Or maybe it's someone below you and you say, I believe in you. And even if no one else believes you, I believe in you. The letter that you write in the next few minutes could change a life. This could be that letter that they file away until the day they die, and this is what gives them hope, meaning, and purpose in their darkest days. So for the remaining time, instead of discussing with the group, we really want to ask you to just pick up a pen and jot down some thoughts to a person that's important in your life. Allow the Holy Spirit to do with your letter for that person what Paul did with his letter for Timothy. I don't think we have any clue how powerful letters can be.